This is What If I Told You, the event psychology video podcast for event professionals in which Victoria Mady, event consultant and host, talks with the world's top minds in behavioral science, neuroscience, and psychology on how to transform events using insights about human behavior and mind. For more science-based tips, join Event Psychology Club at eventpsychology.gumroad.com. Also, check out Victoria's online course, Event Psychology Lab, at eventpsychology.thinkific.com, which covers key behavioral science concepts and offers research-backed solutions to your event challenges. This course is a unique opportunity to upgrade your industry skills and gain a competitive edge without adding to your already busy schedule. Now, enjoy the conversation.
Hello, I'm Victoria Mady, and this is What If I Told You, the event psychology podcast where I talk all things event psychology, that is how to apply brain science insights in events. Today, my guest is Dan Alferov, and Dan is the Director of Empathy Analytics at Heartbeat AI. He focuses on the intersection of behavioral research and data science to solve business challenges by leveraging emotional analytics of text data. As a supporter of mental health advocacy, equity, and diversity, Dan believes in constantly learning how to best support positive societal progress and amplify the voices of those who are systematically disadvantaged. His passions include basketball, travel, and philosophy. Dan, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Victoria. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Wow, travel, philosophy, and basketball. We've got so much more to talk about. I'm very glad that, I have met you recently. And when I discovered that the focus of your work is on emotions and analytics, I immediately wanted to talk. And in advance, we obviously understand the value of emotions in experiences, but funny enough, we are still figuring out how to be more intentional about creating emotional experiences, and with the development of various technologies, how to measure emotions and their impact. So my first question is about your journey. Can you tell me more about what you do and what sparked your interest in this particular field?
Yeah, so initially I started off in my educational background looking at behavioral economics from the perspective of neuroscience. So my formal education is kind of in those two domains. And what was really interesting to me within those two fields is how can we intersect, I guess, the human perspective of decision making in neuroscience within our understanding of economics. Throughout my undergrad, I did a lot of research in the neuroscience space on the side to my schooling, focused on how we perceive emotions and how the perception of emotions can be leveraged in addressing mental health disorder diagnosis with a focus of mood disorders. And so I became really passionate about student experience as well, and looking at the challenges that students face from a mental health standpoint in university, both in terms of a community building sense and also the academic sense. And this kind of led me towards a few passion projects in that space, where I led one of the largest orientations in Canada for undergraduate students. So that was probably my closest experience to events planning, where we designed the programming for those incoming students, as well as facilitated it. And so that was an amazing experience, and it taught me a lot about perspective taking relative to events, and understanding, where people come from different backgrounds, whether it be international students or from different socioeconomic demographics. They have different needs and wants from events, and kind of that perspective. And so growing to understand the student experience and kind of moving on from school led me to an interesting point in my life where I found Heartbeat AI. And so Heartbeat AI really sparked my interest because it kind of combined all of those diverse skill sets that I had developed a passion for into one, where the main focus of Heartbeat AI, our founder, Lana, she calls it the Empathy Analytics Lab. And so our focus is on capturing those human experiences, understanding how to quantify them in a way that's meaningful to represent each one of those groups and their interests and their needs, to inform kind of different ways of solving business challenges that go beyond that traditional kind of short-term thinking or band-aid solutions for an entire demographic.
Mm, mm. And I definitely am going to ask more about, how Heartbeat AI works. But my question right now is about, your perspective on the role of emotions in business in general.
Hmm. Yeah, of course. I think emotions are a bit understood in business in today's sphere. I think the goal of the industry in using emotions typically has been to understand the voice of a critical demographic, whether it's a customer or an employee or a patient in the healthcare setting. But this understanding is often limited towards just measuring emotions. So how can we extract, what is a person feeling from a survey response or their interaction with a touch point along, a customer journey or something like that? And what makes this disconnect happen is that, okay, you get this wonderful perspective that's colored by these emotions, but then what do you do with it from a strategy standpoint? The reality is, businesses don't operate in terms of understanding, some sort of happiness goal that they set for their customers. The idea is often motivated by variables that are downstream and kind of operational. And so what's really interesting, I think, about the role of emotions is solving that challenge of how do you connect those two viewpoints. And moreover, how do you connect the people that are responsible for the experiences of the customers or the patients or employees to have the tools to be able to communicate how to use those experiences from a strategy standpoint, and then also mathematically validate that with what the business models are trying to predict.
Right. But emotions are complex,
Hmm.
and measuring them can be very much challenging. And it is challenging, right? And I know that, well, personally, I lean towards that, opinion that many neuroscientists share, that it's not really possible to measure emotions per se. We can measure sentiment, for example,
Hmm.
right? But it's really we don't have like those universal criteria uh, to um, to sort of sort and categorize emotions, especially when it comes to such a variety of cultures and nuances and emotions that we feel, right? So, what strategies do you suggest for measuring emotions effectively?
Well, I think that's a great point. I think within kind of the neuroscience space, there's a predominant definition that emotions come from a lot of different modalities. So emotions can be spoken emotions. There's a big difference between what you feel internally and how you express yourself externally. There's a lot of these pitfalls that you can fall into. And what I think is beautiful about that, and the fact that it's not really a solved problem as to how we measure it or how we extract that information from text, is that different frameworks can be created for these different contexts. And so my kind of biggest strategy for that is to try to not implore a one size fits all model, but rather come from it from the understanding of we have these sorts of methods for identifying these feelings, sentiments, or emotions, whatever the word is, for that experience variable that you're taking, and really test that measurement capability over how well it holds up to that human experience. And so that's a really big factor. And what I mean by that is, for example, if someone's communicating that they're struggling with career progression within a company, for example, that it's not so much important as to what you classify that emotion as, or how you describe it, whether it's frustration or criticism. That physical classifier is not as important. It's more so about how can you consistently reproduce and find patterns in that experience that match up to other people's experiences. So the
Mm.
idea is finding that way to group a subset of feelings that people are having about a particular theme or a topic that comes up in their day-to-day life, and say that they may express themselves differently, but the core sense and the core foundation of that experience behaviorally is the same. And so one of those strategies that we employ is, so at Heartbeat, we use emotional classification system that's layered. So we measure positive, negative, neutral, the sentiment layer. Then we use primary emotions, which there's about 9 of them in our system, plus a body sense. And they span kind of joy to fear, those typical primary domains that you hear about. And then we also use a secondary level of classification, which tries to address that complexity that you mentioned as well, where sometimes when we are trying to interpret how someone is talking about their emotions, it's hard to place them into one singular distinct bucket. And so how we try to address that challenge is by allowing multiple classifications, allowing something called a multigram, which is a combination of different expressions at once. And so what we try to do is we try to then leverage kind of what we call empathy analytics to detangle all of that emotional complexity and say that, this group of people is struggling with this particular challenge, and the language that's corresponding to that belongs to these emotional domains, and they show up at, a much larger degree than the other emotional domains that we track. And so that allows us to then inform and say, perhaps this group of employees feels like they don't belong in this organization, or they feel disconnected from the team. And it's really about identifying what language characterizes that experience rather than, what emotion. And
Mm.
I think that's kind of the important distinction there, is because, as I said before, emotions are not really explicitly defined as to
Mm.
how we measure them and how we understand them. And so that importance to us becomes about, creating those parallels between the emotional language used and experiences.
Mm. I really love your point about distinguishing between those two things, that the language that we use is kind of indicative of whatever we feel,
Mhm.
but it kind of helps us be more accurate in measuring what people feel, right?
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
and it also goes back to that idea of empathy, right? It's like if you think about a conversational setting where you're opening up to someone about, an issue that you're having in your life, the way you communicate yourself is the primary tool which we, human to human, will be able to build that empathy, because hearing the words that you use, hearing the tone that you use, is really important for me to understand how to provide support to you in that situation.
Right.
And so that's really what we try to capture, is that element of the interaction to then translate that into some sort of strategic action.
Yeah, as someone who studied cognitive linguistics, I'm really, fascinated by the power of language and by the opportunities that it provides. I should probably mention that, mention that Heartbeat AI you work with is a platform that transforms text input from, say, feedback or survey into some categories, emotion categories. But I would like you to tell me more how exactly it works. So, say I'm an event planner and I want to use your platform uh, to um, to analyze the emotions my audience feels. So, how do I do that?
So yeah, so Heartbeat AI, first and foremost, as a is an empathy analytics lab, and so the way that we operate with it at the base level is it is fully supervised, in the sense that we have a taxonomical classification of language that was built in association with kind of linguistics research and experts, and so it classifies just over 50,000 emotional words in English into these 100 secondary emotional domains at the very highest level of complexity. And so how that's useful is that we have a general taxonomy that's kind of context agnostic. And so what we'll do is we'll run it with the general taxonomy, and then say you're running a programming event. And usually, at least from my experience within the student events planning space, there's some sort of curriculum or some sort of messaging that's involved around the event, whether it's a networking event or a workshop. There's some sort of learning outcomes or some sort of framework behind the programming that is very intentional. And so what our goal becomes is to work with you as the expert of that framework and the one that's designing the programming, and help you capture the context window of the language and the emotion that you want to capture. And so what we'll do is we'll take that generalized taxonomy, we'll adjust it to what you as the expert want to measure. If you want to focus on specific words, if you want to focus on the creation of a specific feeling. And so we can move around those taxonomical classifications. What I mean by that is, for example, the word nostalgia can be both positive and negative at the same time, depending on the context. And so if we want to, do some research on understanding what is the language that has to do with Disney movies for children, nostalgia, or for adults rather, nostalgia would be a very positive term in that case, where, it reminds you of when that movie came out and you saw it with your parents, something like that. And so we would adjust that classification to match that context. And so that's kind of how we work around some of those limitations that you mentioned around cultural differences in expression, around, different contexts having a bias towards different emotions even. So it depends how you ask the question, right? If you ask, what were some positive takeaways from the event, you're obviously biasing the language that's going to be responded to you with, because you're prompting it. And so for us, it's all about understanding all of those nuances and positioning the person who's asking the questions, and the client that is looking for the research, as the expert, and helping them build a framework that allows them to understand whatever research question that they have. And so that's one thing that is kind of differentiates us from a lot of other text analytics companies, is that for us, it's all about putting the researcher in the driver's seat and facilitating that relevant context that they need through both emotions and topics and themes. And so in order to do that, we use a variety of natural language processing methods. And one other distinguishing factor is that we actually have a proprietary programming language to write natural language processing rules. And so over the 7 years of our operation, we've written, I think, over 75,000 rules that adjust to context. So it'll pick up on things like sarcasm, negation. And so these are all run by our curation team, which is a team of experts that, is proficient in the language.
How does it work in a different language than English?
Yeah, so there's a couple different methods. So one of them is obviously by taking it through a transition or translation, sorry, program. And so we would translate the native language into English and then use the English analysis. That's kind of the quickest and easiest way to do it, but it has its own pitfalls because translation is notoriously inaccurate, especially when it has to go through things like expressions or idioms or conversational speech, where the literal translation might no longer make sense, whereas it makes sense in the native language. And so what we've done is we've started developing taxonomies for a few other languages, working with linguists in those countries. So our Spanish one is under development, and we did some work with the Russian taxonomy as well. So.
I was wondering about, those words that do not exist in different languages. For example, in Russian, we've got deep blue and light blue, different words and different meanings, right, for those words. While in English, it's just blue, right? So for those kind of things, I guess you would need to have specific processes in place, right, to capture and understand, especially when it comes to words that explain some emotions.
Yeah, and so that's where that kind of programming language comes into play. So the idea would be you would write out a separate subset of rules for that
Right.
specific language case that then can be either applied or not applied depending on the analysis that you're doing. So kind of our priority there is flexibility. And so the flexibility that allows someone who understands the data context or is the expert to be able to mold the tool to that context, And then our strength is that the analytical approaches we use are actually the same context to context. So it's more so about like building the rails for the train to run on. And that's really the how we kind of address those challenges.
Right. But what kind of other challenges you have when it comes to measuring emotions through text data?
Well, there's a lot of them, right? So, when you look at even individual differences, so people, person to person, might have a different way of expressing negative emotion. Whereas, when I maybe on a performance review, me writing bad could be severe compared to someone else's writing terrible, depending on, what my threshold for that communication is, what that person's own kind of emotional intelligence is and emotion communication skills, where they're at. And so the hardest parts are being able to leverage those emotions in a way that can understand those expressive differences across different groups of people. And so part of that has to do with how well do we extract the context of what lies behind it. And so that's one of the things we do where we obviously have topics extraction algorithms that try to say, this person, if we're talking about customer experience, had an issue with the food, whereas this person liked the food. And that allows us to group people based on, those kind of, I guess, facts that exist within their experience. And the idea is to use those facts and those topics that come up and understand how they're interconnected. And if you understand that, kind of the way we approach it is that an emotional experience has and contains many individual feelings. So you can both love and hate your job at the same time, for example. And for us, what's really interesting, what's really meaningful is that what evokes those feelings in your conversation with someone. So, I love communicating and collaborating with my team, but I don't have a clear avenue for, moving vertically within the company, for example. And for us, it's about contextualizing how that language changes between those 2 points and where is someone talking about, something that they are writing to just kind of smooth over their pain point, or where are they really intentionally bothered to it to the point where it's a bigger experience. So something that falls into like that category of someone feeling like they don't have agency at work, or they don't feel a sense of belonging, or they don't, adjust well to the culture, or some of those kind of bigger themes. And so a lot of the challenge becomes, as a researcher, as someone who's trying to capture this very specific experience across a lot of people, what do the signatures of that experience look like? And then what are the contextual elements that come together in different ways for different people that yield that same language? And so
Mm,
that's really how kind of we are able to anchor that and rein that in, is by building out this context in a way that's focused on that human experience. So trying to understand, okay, topic A came up, topic B came up, they have an overlap in emotions that lies in this specific language types. And together, when people generally use that language, it means that they're feeling disconnected from their work environment. So it no longer becomes, what specific emotions is individual A feeling, individual B feeling. It's more so like the signature of feeling that you don't belong is colored by these specific emotional words.
mm,
And once you're able to identify that kind of fingerprint, that's when you're able to see traces of those experiences across people that express themselves very
mm,
differently.
mm,
And that's when it becomes actionable, because you can kind of use a generalized approach at that point to track, what is that individual piece of their experience? What does it look like? And how is it flavored across different conversation types and different people
mm,
expressing themselves?
mm. Sounds exactly what the events need, I think. Do you have any examples to share about events and applying emotional analytics in events?
So, unfortunately, we haven't had an opportunity to really work with the event space too much. We're currently looking at student engagement as one of the potential, I guess, industries to try this analytical methodology out in. And so the idea there is when you look at student engagement, the idea is to build a community around a specific student demographic first and foremost, and then there's some sort of learning outcomes that stem from that. And so what we want to do is find a way to consolidate the feedback that students provide after events, whether it's conversational, whether it's survey. We haven't really decided on what the best method for that would be yet. But to consolidate that feedback into one place and to understand what are the emotional signatures of all of those different student experiences, whether it's someone who's an introverted student that's going to a networking event, that's going to have a completely different experience than someone who's an extrovert. And then obviously cultural and socioeconomic background differences are really important in student groups. And so what we want to track is, say you have a summer of programming planned where students are coming to the university for the first time. They need to be integrated into the community, and then there's also a variety of different challenges that they're going to see that are very sequential and typical to someone who's coming to university. And that provides a really good environment for data to be able to understand, what are the commonalities in all of those experiences, and what is our programming missing in terms of addressing that. And so that's kind of how we view that application. Is it's about understanding what promotes engagement in terms of events and what detracts from that engagement. And that's kind of the primary way that we've seen the integration with events planning, but we have yet to test it. So it's definitely something we're very open to and excited for. But we're very new to the space in terms of understanding,
Mm,
how to apply it.
mm. Well, I believe that, emotional analytics is something that events need. And, in many different ways, from trying to understand the audience better and trying to increase engagement at events and maintain a sense of belonging. And also from, the standpoint of empathy
Mhm.
and emotional intelligence, because this is something I think we all agree that this is something that the world needs more than ever today, right?
Mhm.
And actually, that was one of my questions. Where do you think the world stands today when it comes to empathy?
Yeah, I think empathy as a term is thrown around very loosely. And I think one of the biggest distinctions for me is that people often confuse compassion for empathy. And so there's a really famous video by a sociologist. I can't remember quite what the video is, but it talks about the distinction between compassion and empathy. And where we kind of draw the line, I think, in a business context, is at that compassion point, because it feels enough to understand what the emotions of a group are, but not to sit with them and resolve how to move forward from those emotions. And that's where compassion kind of translates to empathy. Is it's that idea of, hey, someone's world is raining and you're like, oh, that sucks, it's raining, versus I'm going to take an umbrella, I'm going to sit with you here, and then we're going to understand, what is the best course of action to, get out of
I
this
love I love
state.
this example. Yeah.
And so I think that's what it's really about in a business context. And I think one of the interesting things that's going on right now is that there's a lot more social accountability for business practices and companies. And if you look at, for example, well, it's Pride Month right now, and so every single big company has some sort of Pride initiative. And what's really interesting about a lot of those different initiatives is that they're still focused on bringing attention to the company, eh, instead of addressing the issues that that demographic faces. And one of the arguments for empathy kind of in business and in the world state is that optimizing around that idea of making everyone feel involved and maximizing productivity in that way might actually be cheaper and more sustainable in the long run than trying to create short-term solutions or operate in traditional kind of business action frameworks. And so that's where I'm a very strong believer that I think that element of sustainability and sustainable growth is going to become a significant competitive advantage. not only from the point of view of, I'm running a business, I have employees, I need to keep them happy, and I need to, create this space for them. In the same way that event planning needs to create a space for people, work very much so is not exempt from that.
Mm.
It also becomes about how do we then create a sustainable footprint in the broader society? Because our consumers are going to start caring if we care about the environment, if we care about these different social issues. And that's where I think, because businesses have a lot of power and have a large platform to influence a lot of these different viewpoints. And as we kind of become a more global society where we have access to a diversity of these perspectives and we can understand systematic challenges and systematic barriers better, it almost becomes kind of, a necessity to be able to act on that and to have an opinion on that in the first place.
Mm.
And those kinds of values connections between businesses, consumers, or, however you want to break down that relationship, are going to be critical going forward. They're already starting to become critical. We see, how controversial some of these issues are, like Bud Light's choice of a spokesperson that was trans, right? All of that stuff has repercussions in terms of the customers and the perception of the brand. And so
Mm.
as that kind of builds more and more, which I think it will, then empathy becomes kind of critical towards being able to solve these challenges, because no one person can understand the perspective of everyone else. But technology provides an avenue where we can at least capture that in a way that allows a person to navigate that from a leadership standpoint.
Mm.
And that kind of addresses that challenge, I believe.
Mm. So many great points. Thank you. I've got a couple of final questions. So, what resources would you recommend to event marketers, event designers looking to try emotional analytics for their events?
I mean, where I would start would just be from understanding, uh, different sociological backgrounds of socioeconomic groups. So things like philosophy, my interest in philosophy comes from the fact that philosophy is an interesting science, and that there are no set ways of doing things. Everyone can have their own view on the world. And so, one of the biggest resources for me has been reading feminist philosophy, with things like Simone de Beauvoir, The Second Sex is a great book to read about, that talks about perspectives of women throughout history, and um, that idea of how women view space versus men, for example, is a really interesting distinction to bring up. There's also African philosophy that is very much focused on community and how to create, benefit for everyone in the community, as opposed to, Western philosophy, which is more individualistic. And so I think for events planning, in terms of understanding how to leverage those emotions, the first thing that you need to do is build some sort of perspective into what the needs of those different demographics coming to your events would be. And once you kind of have that foundation, then it becomes about, what is the best way to capture that emotion? I think the easiest way to capture that emotion historically has been through text and feedback forms, which is kind of why we focus on that realm. And once you kind of have an idea of, what is the experience you want to create, or what's missing from the experience of these different groups, that's when, the text analytics resources are there. There's a lot of great resources on natural language processing. So I would start kind of, if you're looking to learn about natural language processing, there's a lot of great blogs online, and just looking at the sentiment level. The sentiment level is kind of the most widely seen right now, where it's about the categorization of language into positive, negative, and neutral. And so that kind of keeps the modeling and the understanding of that really simple. And that's a great place to start. And, whether you want to run your own kind of sentiment models, or you want to look into companies that have specialized use cases for that, I think it's all really great steps to take towards being able to, create some sort of measure of what that experience is like in terms of
Mm.
events. And I think
Mm.
that's the goal. But I think I would start in terms of, the planning phase. And one of the things that helped me was learning about diversity and inclusivity through a lot of the university workshops I did. It really opened my eyes to that ability of perspective taking. And I think the most practical kind of application from that is being able to create programming that's intentional towards those different perspectives at once without necessarily alienating, one group or another. I think
Mm,
that's a very big challenge in the industry of event planning in general.
mm, mm. Okay, thank you. And my last question is the signature question I always ask my guests. So the podcast title is What If I Told You? Can you complete the sentence with one takeaway relevant to our conversation?
Yeah, what if I told you that emotions can be represented effectively from text, and that you can find a sense of commonality between different groups of individuals and what their needs are based on how they communicate to you about their interactions with your business, with your events, or even their day-to-day life if you want to look at something like student experience. And that finding that point of commonality allows you to take better action towards addressing the needs of a large number of groups, because it's something that is not always possible for people in that decision making seat that don't necessarily have the time to talk to every single individual and understand and empathize with their perspective.
Mm,
So in short, what if I told you that empathy is scalable, and empathy in terms of measuring emotional language is quite an important tool towards being able to take the right action?
This is excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dan, for joining me today. That was an excellent conversation. I learned so much, and I invite everyone to connect with Dan and, of course, learn more about emotions and emotional analytics in particular, and consider including it into your event evaluation processes. Thank you for tuning in to What If I Told You, the Event Psychology Podcast. For more brain science insights and for this episode recap, I invite you to join the Event Psychology Club. Also, if you'd like to upgrade your skills and get research-based solutions for your events, I invite you to take the Event Psychology Lab online course that I created for event profs like you. Until next time, bye-bye.